presented by Caltech.
Good evening. I am Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, the Chair of the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences at Caltech. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's William and Myrtle Harris Distinguished Lecture in Science and Civilization. This lecture series, which began in 1996, was made possible by the generosity of William and Myrtle Harris to enable the History and Philosophy of Science program at Caltech to bring to campus distinguished scientists to speak about important issues in science and history. The Harrises have a special interest in the ethical implication of science discoveries and the scientific endeavor. Tonight's lecture by Andrew Hodges will clearly go to the heart of this interest. It is my additional pleasure to introduce Diana Kormos-Buchwald, who will present our speaker. Professor Buchwald joined Caltech in 1989 and has been a core member of the History of Science group here ever since. Since 2000, she has also been the senior editor of the Einstein Papers and the director of the Einstein Papers project at Caltech. And this spring, we celebrated the arrival of the 14th volume of Einstein's edited papers, as well as the launch of an open access website by Princeton University Press. So you will sooner or later get to know everything you ever wanted to know about Einstein. But right now, let me welcome Diana, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Jean-Laurent, for the kind introduction, and welcome again to the Beckman Auditorium. Princeton University Press, the publisher of Einstein's collected papers, is also the proud publisher of our tonight's speaker book, famous book, Alan Turing, The Enigma. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Hodges, Senior Research Fellow and Tutor in Mathematics at Wadham College at the University of Oxford. Wadham College, of course, has a very long history in the history of science, since it was there that the founding members of the Royal Society met for several years before founding the Royal Society at Gresham College in London. Dr. Hodges' principal scientific research lies in the application of twisted geometry to fundamental physics, and twisted theory is the creation of mathematician and physicist Sir Roger Penrose. The theory attempts to describe space and time in a completely new way, using the geometry of twisted space, and it aims to reformulate fundamental physics in this twisted geometry. Ultimately, Dr. Hodges and his colleagues, some of whom are at Caltech here tonight, hope that a complete and correct description of gravity and quantum mechanics can be given in this new framework, theoretical framework. But in addition to his purely mathematical and physical mathematical scientific work, Dr. Hodges has published many articles and book chapters, not only on Alan Turing, but on more general scientific questions, such as computability, re-evaluations of Gödel's proof, current advances in quantum theory, the mechanical mind, mathematics and war, and he has published a popular book on mathematics, 1 to 9, The Inner Life of Numbers. Dr. Hodges has also been a very early gay activist before the gay liberation movement gained broader impetus in the mid and late 1980s. Alan Turing's extraordinary work in mathematics and computation during World War II was a state secret for many decades. At the end of 1976, the BBC showed a television series called The Secret War. In its last episode, there was the first serious documentary account of what had happened at Bletchley Park, which had, Dr. Hodges recalls, quite a good account for the time of the code-breaking method for the Enigma. This set Dr. Hodges on the path to writing a most extraordinary book, now called a classic scientific biography, Alan Turing, The Enigma, published in 1983. The book was available at the front of the auditorium, and Dr. Hodges has kindly agreed to sign copies of the book here on stage after he takes questions, after he delivers his talk on Alan Turing. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Hodges.
Well, good evening, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak at Caltech, where, as Diana has explained, I do have a wonderful connection with my developments in physics as well, so it's a double pleasure to be here. But let's get down to talking about Alan Turing, and also, let's from the start remember I'm asked to speak in a context of talking about science and civilization, which is quite a formidable thing to approach. And I've got a sort of double approach to this. We're talking about an individual person, a very individual life, very special person. But at the same time, I want to think about this context of the whole questions of science and civilization that are central to the world and its problems. And there is a bit of a puzzle here. I mean, biography, such as I did do, is something which often people think is not really analytical. It's not really sort of it's got a theory to it. It's just a list of dates and when people did things, and you look up what they did and write them down. And of course, it could be a bit like that. But to me, it's always been both about doing justice to what a very individual person can do, and the very nature of human personality and personhood, but also a lens through which one sees the wider story of a whole world in motion, in transition, and the interaction between the individual and that wider great movement of events. And so there are large stories involved in Alan Turing, and one of them, for instance, is the historical story of the 20th century, of the warfare and of great power, moving from basically imploding Europe to the United States, and that's something Alan Turing is a big part of that story. There's a technical story of the emergence of the digital world that is so dominating. It's the beginning of that. It's the digital paradigm, which only long after his death really became so dominant. There are questions really about the whole future identity of humanity. It sounds a bit grandiose, but he did address questions both of artificial intelligence and of mathematical biology, which could mean really taking control of the basic biology which governs our actual physical existence. And there's a fourth theme too, which is now much more clear than it would have been even 10 or 15 years ago. His sexuality as a gay man in that period is now something which is seen as a question to do with fundamental human rights. And the story of things that happened to him, that experienced, and his reaction to them is now something that's seen in a much wider context. I think at the time I was writing in the 1970s, as has been described, it was still seen as something that was a very unfortunate side issue, an individual tragedy, and a rather embarrassing question too, that people didn't necessarily want to have brought out in the open. But society changes, the world changes, politics change, and now we have something that is recognized as a paradigm of questions of individual freedom and individual development and individual expression in a way that wouldn't have been possible not so long ago. But now, having raised those grand themes, and they are themes which are present in everything that we read and do, Alan Turing himself was not a great commentator on these questions of science and civilization. I can't imagine him standing here and giving a lecture on science and civilization. Actually, I can't imagine myself giving a lecture. I'm not sure I'm in the right place, really, and I'm going to get down to more brass tacks about what he did in a minute. But just to put it in context, he wasn't that sort of guy. He actually carried on very much as really most mathematicians and scientists do, which is loving the hands-on work, the correctness, the good judgment and imagination, and not really developing great theories of the ultimate goals or impact on humanity of the work that's being done. And that's a question about science in general. It is how we operate. We do our thing. We love doing our thing. We talk it up, and we hope to get some money for it, and we hope for the best. And in a way, that is something that, in many branches of science, is problematic and is not always aired as much as it might be. In the 1930s and 1940s, in Alan Turing's time, there was an enormous amount of discussion about the place of science and the role of science in the society of the future. People like H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, Bernard Shaw, who Alan Turing was actually very keen on as a writer, other figures from the left, Bernal, Haldane, other people responding to that within mathematics and science. There was a big debate about the nature of science, and indeed humanist commentators would contribute considerably. But that's not something that there are people he was sort of known all about, but he wasn't himself one of those groups of commentators. So what I'll do is follow his life through and see these critical engagements that he had as an individual in this great stream of events, see how he was at the nexus of some of these great themes, but not as an active contributor to a philosophy, but someone who in a way is a mirror of what science is like in the main, which is of these amazing efforts to find the truth, to dig down and find fundamental truths which can have enormous changes and impacts of which at the time people are quite unaware, and just see what happened. So the first of these, well, let's have another picture. I want to have a picture. Yeah, I want a picture that will illustrate something about him, and that is this picture that's Alan Turing on the left. And he's there. The point is, these are the most ordinary guys of 1946, just after the war, and the running club that he joined in South London. He was a great long-distance runner. They're going off to a meeting. On the bus, it says, I think, Walton Athletic Club. And this is a marvelous black and white photo of that grainy era. And there he is, and you'll see this certain little distance there. You may detect a certain in the crowd, but not of the crowd. And you'll see that again in other photographs. But it does illustrate something I want to suggest. I was actually used an expression of Walt Whitman's as an epigraph for one of the chapters in my book, and it's something that does sum up the themes which I've been mentioning, of talking about individuality and taking it extremely seriously, and yet being part of a world, and indeed seeing oneself rather a democratic world, a world in which, in the 20th century, the whole of humanity takes a part. It isn't something which is meant to be governed just by a tiny elite. And that is the spirit in which I'll talk about his story. And here, again, just so we know who we're talking about, here's another picture of Alan Turing, now at 17, at the very beginning of his life. Again, in a group of lads from his school. These are much posher lads. These are from his upper middle class schooling of a very old-fashioned kind, which I won't go on about very much, but that was his background. But again, this little sense of intensity and within the group, but not of the group, which you may discern in that picture. That's a holiday picture in April 1930, and it was actually a period at which he himself was recovering from what had been a very recent bereavement of the young man at that school, who otherwise might have been in that group of boys, who'd suddenly died, a young man who'd been obviously extremely smitten by, and who influenced the course of his thoughts for the next 2 or 3 years very intensely. So you wouldn't see that looking at the picture. That's in a way a picture of inner life that you can't see. It's something that we can read into it because we know from his writings, which he was very open about his feelings and the meaningfulness of it, but that's not something you can see in the picture itself. Now let's move on to, because time doesn't allow me to describe all the aspects of what he did, but I want to move into a central thing that he did do. That photo was taken in 1930, and no one would have known he was that special. He was special within a limited context of the school, but hardly a famous person. By 1936, he did have a kind of fame, and that was a very rapid transition. He did work when he was very young. That brought him into the forefront of world thought. And that's the concept of the Turing machine, which he developed while at Cambridge as what we'd now call well, he was a postgraduate, I mean, the whole system was different, but basically as a graduate student at Cambridge in 1935. So I've got to tell you a little bit about why the Turing machine is an important idea and how it is the foundation of the whole digital world in which we live now. And it was conceived by Alan Turing as a work of imagination, not as a work of doing engineering with actual machines or computers at the time. It's paper work, a work of thought and creative thought within the world of mathematics, but reaching outside mathematics. And the thing that within mathematics hit him in 1935 was a very abstract and philosophical question, nothing to do, you might think, with the world of computers at all, but an abstract question to do with the question of what does it mean to say you have a definite method or procedure for doing something. And that was the paper which addressed this question and came up with a new definition, that of computability. And the actual title, you see, does involve this long German word, which means decision problem, which he wrote in. This, incidentally, is probably an example of Turing not doing the thing which is most calculated to get public attention. On the whole, if you write the first paper, it's probably not a good idea to have a word in it which almost no one understands at all. But that's by the by. So let me just run over what the nature of Turing's answer was. It was, and I can encapsulate it now in an anachronistic way. His answer was that a definite method meant something a computer program can do. That's what it means now. But of course, there weren't any computers then. There weren't any computers, and there weren't any computer programs. So he imagined the computer. In fact, he said, essentially, he invented it for this purpose. And there's a very specific thing which he did, which hadn't been done before, but did have a base. It wasn't all his own. It came from work that had taken place in the great revolution in mathematical thought of a few years earlier in the great logician Kurt Gödel. Gödel had shown that statements about numbers could be encoded in terms of numbers, and that gave a great revolution in logic. Turing's idea was that operations on numbers could also be encoded as numbers. And that really is the revolution in computing, which all computers now use. There's not really any distinction between a line of noughts and ones which represents data and a line of noughts and ones that represent instructions on operations to do on those numbers. They're all transmitted and pushed around inside your computer in the same way. That you wouldn't see from that paper that he wrote, but that counterintuitive idea was at the center of his thought. But he went further than that, because he didn't just think about what it was like to write things down on paper. He was thinking about what it would mean, in a sense, actually to do a calculation. It had a physical flavor. It had the concept of a machine, the concept of engineering something, the concept of something that would actually work and produce an answer. And that's what pushes it into the realm of an engineering discipline, computer science, of the modern world. That's something quite new that went outside the mathematical world in which this problem was posed, and it set into motion a completely new world of thought. And it brought in more as well, because what Turing did went into the world of psychology and philosophy of mind and analyzed what it meant for a person, a human being, to be doing a procedure, doing something which ended in a definite result. And that meant an invasion into the world of the mind and of thinking, which then was followed up much subsequently in much more radical thinking about what the nature of the mind and its relationship to computing, but it starts even here. And that culminated in this paper in what he called the invention of a universal machine, and that is simply the computer that we now take for granted, on which you can put any software you like that will perform any task that can be encapsulated in a program. You don't have to change the machine, you just load different software onto it. That's now so natural it's hard to think that that was a strange idea. Everyone just assumes there's software available for all sorts of different tasks. But that would have been a very radical idea in 1936. It would have been obvious that you need a big machine for big problems and a small one for small problems and a different one for numerical problems and another one for sorting problems and another one for whatever it is, measuring or photographs. They're all different problems. Turing's idea, which is now driving the whole industry so powerfully, is that a single machine can do all of those things. And these are the actual words: the universal computing machine, and the strange word he used, not a very mathematical word, the word invent. Invent as a single machine that can be used to compute. Well, that's, in the language of his paper, that means to play out any program. So that was the idea he had in 1936. Well, that was a revolutionary thought, and it did propel him to the center of the world stage, but in a very tiny stage. That is to say, the world of mathematical logic and the foundations of mathematics was a very, very small one indeed. And indeed, at Cambridge, where he was based, it was only one or two people who would have taken an interest in this subject at all. The world center in this area had moved essentially from Germany to Princeton in the United States. And that move was itself, of course, a reflection of the changes of the 1930s and the transformation of Germany under Nazi rule. So we're already in a world which is moving towards a terrible denouement. And he arrived at Princeton in 1936 to take up this work in the company, of Alonzo Church, who led the group at Princeton. That's a photograph which has turned up comparatively recently. It was only developed about 70 years after it was taken. And that's Alan Turing on the right. And he is literally only just in the picture. That's rather symbolic. That was rather what his life there was like. He was not seen as a central figure to what was going on. And you may notice this sideways look and not perhaps paying attention to the subject matter of this seminar. He had thoughts of his own. And perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but the very way the snapshot's been taken is something of a symbolic thing. But he was indeed thinking of ideas of his own which weren't part of his regular mathematical career. At this stage, he was certainly building what would have been a very successful career in pure mathematics, doing all the right things, writing a very prolific work in a number of areas of pure mathematics, which is just what he should be doing, as well as what was actually technically a PhD thesis on further developments in symbolic logic, themselves very deep and original, but I won't be speaking about. Because I'll be speaking about something else which leads to the next stage of the story, in which people will probably have a great interest, namely codes and ciphers. And the origin of his interest is an interesting one, and the first record of it is in this very early period, October 1936, just having arrived at Princeton. And there's a connection between the abstract mathematical work that went into what I've just described about the Turing machine and the concept of developing codes and ciphers in a modern way. And the connection is, you see here, is the question of the most general kind of code and cipher, which is essentially the same type of question as the most general thing that you would call a procedure. He's applied the idea that went into the Turing machine to think about the nature of codes and ciphers. And in particular, this is again a very typical thing of Turing. It wasn't just generalities, but he liked getting his hands dirty with particular examples and things that would actually work in practice. And so he thought about some particular and interesting codes, one of them being impossible to decode without the key. Again, he's thought of what are essentially modern ideas about what we'd call now cipher security measures or complexity measures. We don't know, unfortunately, how far this work went because we have no written record of it. But interesting that even at this stage, he was thinking about the fact that it would indeed have application to actual governments. And very shortly, in fact, in 1937, he was formulating a particular cipher mechanism involving a binary multiplier built with electrical parts, which had a part in some quite advanced scheme for performing cipher operations. Again, another picture just to show you who we're talking about at this period. This is, I think, in his mother's garden back in England. Then that was the important point I'm coming to, that was that there is a real moment of decision in Alan Turing's life. In 1938, when this period at Princeton came to an end, he had to decide what to do. And he actually turned down what would have been a very admirable and sensible thing to do, taking up a postdoctoral position with John von Neumann as a leading mathematician now in the United States. Instead, he returns to England, even though he didn't have a proper job lined up at Cambridge, and he immediately gave his ideas about ciphering to the government and joined the British government's cipher department. Again, we would like to know more about exactly how this happened, but there's no great mystery about it because the Cambridge environment that he was in was one where there were strong personal connections between its figures and the people who'd done code-breaking work during the First World War. In particular, John Maynard Keynes, who was a leading figure at King's College, Cambridge, where Turing had been a student and became a fellow, was a friend and indeed had been a lover of one of the leading code breakers, Dilwyn Knox, and the connection may well have been made through him, but there were other King's College figures as well. So this was a very smooth transition. The thing that perhaps wasn't completely smooth was that Alan Turing was the first scientific figure to be taken into this code-breaking work, which hitherto had been dominated by classical, literary, textual analysis type of people who saw code breaking as a matter of word juggling rather than as mathematical and logical apparatus. So that was new, but nevertheless the department was in fact modernizing itself and took on further mathematicians very rapidly in 1939, so Turing was not alone. But it was this is a big decision, and of course it was influenced by his awareness of the imminence of the Second World War and his knowledge, which had been reinforced by a personal visit to Nazi Germany. I mean, you couldn't be at Princeton in that period anyway without being very aware of the whole question of Nazi Germany and the refugees from Germany. It was something that was absolutely in the you couldn't be unaware of it all the time, at any time. But there is another element to think of in all this, that he wasn't simply a mathematician or a Cambridge mathematician or an English figure. He also had an identity as a young gay man. At Cambridge, and particularly in the college where he found himself, he was in a very protected position. This was the kind of environment which was where the Bloomsbury group of writers and artists, there was their natural habitat. It was a protected and artificially protected world, but it was one in which he was comparatively safe. He would have been perfectly aware that in other areas, and in particular in the United States, he was much, much more lonely. And indeed, during his period in the United States, he was certainly depressed about his prospects and his life as a young gay man, and formulated a plan for suicide at some point, or at least something he could thought of, at least at some moments, and communicated it to a boyfriend of his, James Atkins, whom he'd met at Cambridge in 1933. And James recalls, and very vividly recalled to me, how it involved an Apple an apple and electrical wiring, these being elements in his, I'm giving a spoiler here because many people will know that these are the elements which did play a part in Alan Turing's actual death in 1954. This plan was conceived at that period, and it has extraordinary resonance because in 1938, the famous Disney film of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs played at Cambridge, and Turing went to see it along with the other Cambridge dons, particularly the King's College dons. This is the sort of slightly camp thing that they were noted for, and he himself took particular pleasure in this scene of the poisoned apple, the very famous scene, and I think that's because he had already conceived of a plan involving a poisoned apple. The whole point about it being is that it was something that would disguise suicide as an accident, playing on his hobby of chemical experiments, something which horrified his mother and something she was always nagging him about, and so would provide a very suitable cover, playing on his apparent clumsiness to give an impression that it happened by accident. That we'd like to know more about that. He certainly had such a plan, and indeed he talked about it later on in his life as well. So it's a period which this is the transition that he made from this pure mathematical world to a world of great involvement in the center of worldly events. And it couldn't have been more dramatic. And this photograph is a very remarkable one of that exact moment of transition. That's Alan Turing at the front, and behind him is, at the back, is another King's College fellow, and between them are two boys from Nazi Germany whom they'd helped to bring to England as part of the last-minute rescue of young Jewish people from the Nazi Empire. And they'd escaped in March 1939. And they gave them a week boating holiday here on the south of England. In fact, it was a very notable week in history. It was the last week of peace before the Second World War broke out. It was the moment that Germany and the Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact, and which really sealed the fate of Poland and set in motion the Second World War. No one looking at that picture, that scene there, could possibly have guessed. Well, they wouldn't have guessed the stories of these young boys, who of course lost their families and everything in the years that followed, but they would never have guessed that the guy at the front was in fact going to be one of the most effective people in doing something about that situation, and that indeed turned out to be the case, because the next thing he did next week was getting involved with down to earth with the problem of the Enigma. The Enigma was the machine on which all German military communications were enciphered, and because it was a comparatively sophisticated mechanical device, did need some mathematical and logical tools and not purely linguistic ones. And that was where the impact of mathematical and scientific thought really did begin to play a large role. So I'm not going to describe how it worked, there's not time for that, but there are many ways of finding out about that. But to give I'll give an account of where it took Alan Turing at this extraordinary juncture where scientific ideas played this very unexpected part in the outcome, the day-by-day outcomes, and then the eventual outcome of the Second World War. Turing had already got involved with the code breaking before the war. As I said, he's actually joined up in 1938. And so he would have learnt in July 1939 of the information which reached the British from Poland. Poland had a very particular part in this story because Polish mathematicians were miles in advance of anyone else in having made a mathematical attack on the problem of the Enigma. And they gave it to Britain and France in July 1939 after a guarantee had been given to Poland, a guarantee which turned out not to be worth very much, but did bring Britain and France into the war in September 1939. And that information was of enormous value, and where Alan Turing took off from. And his thoughts were actually the initial thoughts are actually in this building, which is still there on the site at Bletchley Park in central England. This was a move out of London into a country town location away from bombing, and that remained the center of all of the secret work on communications throughout the Second World War, and that was where he was based. This is what he did. What he was able to do reflected what I've already described about his work in logic. It brought together both advanced ideas in logic, but also the engineering that made something that had this character of actually getting down to it and actually doing something, not just thinking about it. That was very, very typical of him. So he had a very beautiful logical idea, for which this is his own handwritten diagram. It's a diagram of logical implications, and just to give you a hint of what it's about, it's the network here is one which represents a flow of implications of logical propositions. So when you have a closed loop here, and you've got quite a lot of them here, that gives the opportunity for there either to be consistency when you go around a loop or contradiction. And by chasing up those consistency and contradiction ideas very close to the mathematical logic he'd studied earlier, you can arrive at a very brilliant and beautiful way of eliminating the possibilities for these settings for the Enigma machine and arriving at the one that had actually been used for a particular message. This is the machine built by the British subsidiary of IBM in 1939-1940, which encapsulated that logic. Of course, you can't see the logic in the machine. This is the trouble with seeing the physical object. You can't see what's inside it. But what you can see, all these rotors, those rotors are the input device for up to 30 or so letters of a message which you have correctly guessed. And that was the foundation of the method, and that Turing worked out the entire theory of that. This was done extremely quickly. Even in November 1939, Turing announced what was called the super bomb. This is what this was. The funny name is because the Polish mathematicians had called a smaller machine, a more limited kind of machine, a bomba, for reasons which remain obscure. And Turing's idea, which was a great development and enhancement of their ideas, they called a super bomb. And eventually, the first one was working already in March 1940, and thereafter hundreds more were built to take on the great volume of German military and naval communications. So Turing was in at the beginning of this, and he was a leader in this. He wasn't alone in this. Another mathematician, Gordon Welchman, played a very important part, and then a team developed, which he led and inspired with a lot of new ideas. These were ideas in Bayesian probability methods for automating, for streamlining, for rationalizing every kind of guessing and estimation that's involved in code breaking. He wrote a paper on this, which was actually only declassified in 2012, but now can be read and is a very nice introduction to the work they did. So it was work on a scientific level. There were beautiful tricks involved, but it involved scientific principle in a way that hadn't been brought into this work before. The work expanded. There's a great deal of complexity about how it was done. It required captures of German vessels to get extra pieces of information which are needed. I can't go into that. But the upshot was that the war on the Atlantic was his realm. It was the naval Enigma which was the most difficult. It had the most advanced form of use of the Enigma, the highest cipher security in modern terms, by the addition of another layer of encipherment. And that was the thing which he took on very individually and made his thing. And it was also the most important in the Western war, simply because naval war, by definition, is a war absolutely of information. It is of messages sent and received and exact positions known and so forth. And without information, you have very little idea what's going on. That was a vital feature of the war, and it became, of course, an Anglo-American war with the entry of the United States. Of course, in practice, the entry was before the Pearl Harbor in December 1941, because the United States was given took on a role in the Atlantic before that, and was admitted into some of the British secrets before that. But after the official entry of the United States, Anglo-American cooperation became a pivotal, absolutely central part of the war effort. And unfortunately, for the British, one of the best things they had to offer the United States at that point was the fantastic success with the Enigma decryption. That really was one of the few cards they held at a time when British forces really were doing absolutely nothing to fight Germany anywhere else in Europe or Africa. They were very much on the back foot. This was the one area where the Brits were ahead, and it was something they could offer. But unfortunately, at just that point, in February 1942, the the U-boats in particular in the Atlantic went on to a more complicated form of the Enigma, and all of that was wiped out overnight. So it was a desperate situation of trying to get back into it. Turing's role was a liaison with the United States to overcome that problem. Well, the overcoming was done in several different ways, but in particular, in November 1942, he arrived at New York and spent time in Washington and at Dayton, Ohio, where the American versions of the bombs were built, and then also in New York, as I'll describe in a moment. I've given a little quotation here of, I think we want some words that reflect the Turing way of speaking, which certainly could have a certain ring about them. This is his way of reporting back home to what he thought of the staff in the US Navy's cryptanalytic department. So when he talks about these, one cannot very well trust these people. It is, I'm afraid to say, the United States Navy that he's talking about. But I should also emphasize that there was very rapid changes that were taking place on the American side at this very time, so that the situation he described soon became rather different. These words illustrate the fact that he was in a pivotal, it was in a central place of the whole war effort at this point, dealing with matters which are absolutely central to the conduct of the Atlantic War and the preparations for the invasion of Europe in 1944, but at the same time dealing with very tricky individual situations and with very complex logical problems and questions of engineering as well. They had to handle all of that. Now, an important development here, because now, once we get to the middle of the war, Turing's certainly looking towards the end of the war and what's going to happen afterwards. And one thing he did realize was the great importance of electronics. He was actually introduced to electronic technology, probably first a bit back at Bletchley, but then more because it was his job while in New York to vet on behalf of the British government the speech cipher system that had been developed by Bell Laboratories and would be used by the top-level radio telephone conversations between Churchill and Roosevelt in the conduct of the latter part of the war. So this was a very advanced system using massive amount of electronics, and it was Turing's job to decide on its security on behalf of the British government. It was in this period that he met a parallel figure, Claude Shannon, the founder of communication or information theory, who had many parallel ideas. And it was a theorem of Shannon's that Turing used when he went ahead in 1944, when he got back, to develop a completely new type of encipherment system for speech. This is actually a photograph of a real, actually built Turing machine, built with his own hands, with electronic parts. It tells you a lot, this. This was a stage of the war when other people might have gravitated towards being on powerful committees, pushing their ideas, empire building, and so forth. Turing did quite the opposite. he moved sideways from the cipher establishment. He found a way of getting on with this thing with his own hands as a new problem, something quite fresh, using this new technology. And he just liked working away with just one electronic assistant, who was actually, I must say, he was very keen on. And this was also an element in his situation, but did not with any satisfying results. But nevertheless, that was part of the situation. And it was in these circumstances that, very odd circumstances, if you like, that he conceived of the modern idea of the digital computer. It was the computer needed at least three things going into it to make sense of what we'd now call a whole digital computer revolution. One of them Turing had communicated, but very few people really understood, and that is the theory of computation and the idea of a universal machine. The second thing is this motivation and experience with what we now call algorithms, all the things you'd want to do with a computer, because there'd been multiple things they'd done, one thing after another in the code breaking, all requiring special methods, new machines or whatever, but now they could all be done as something you would write as programs. But thirdly, you needed the electronic technology to have sufficient speed to do all the logical operations that were needed. All these things together he called the idea of building a brain. Electronic brain was a word that came in very rapidly after the war, and some people would have thought it a vulgar use, but Turing actually liked it. That was because he always was interested in the relationship between the computer and the human brain. And he made a great deal of that and developed that into the theory of artificial intelligence. So this was the point, as I've indicated at the beginning. He was there at this emergence of a whole new paradigm of digital world, the digital computation, what you can do in the digital sphere. This is where it happened. But he wasn't really the person to elaborate it as a question of this is how civilization is going to go, I'm afraid, but he did see that it was going to be big. I mean, he did see within the realm of technology and mathematics, and it wasn't a word of computer science then, but he saw it. He put this particular quote is a very elegant way of expressing the idea of what we'd now see as the way that you can just switch one program off and stick another one on, and it will change the computer's work from one field to something utterly different. And he gave many other examples, ranging from mathematics to chess playing to data processing and things related to code breaking, non-numerical things, so a whole great range of things. Now, the machine that he designed in 1946 with an elaborate, detailed electronic design was in fact built by 1950. And it's been in the Science Museum since 1958 or so. It's never somehow attracted a great deal of attention, but it was definitely his thing, and in that sense, he really did not only have the idea of the computer, but actually push forward this particular building development. But he was too impatient to see it through to 1950, and in fact, he moved off to Manchester, where the different development was going ahead at a higher speed, and so he left the first development and went on to Manchester, where he was based for the rest of his life. These are his, I think, more lasting ideas are not in the electronic design, but in the concept of software as developed in these ideas. And you can see the big thinking by him saying every known process has got to be translated into what we'd now call software, and seeing that the computer itself would be doing the software production, which is something that's now done through editors, compilers, interpreters, but that was miles ahead at that time to see that. But nevertheless, all based on the ideas which came from his 1930s logic. Turing himself never made much of the idea that it was his thing, that the computer was his idea. John von Neumann, who came out with a report in June 1945, was always credited with having formulated it first. There's a whole argument about how much von Neumann would have got from Turing. They had interacted in the 1930s, which I can't go into. Turing himself was, as I said, was reticent about these questions. And in fact, the only time, as far as I can see, anyone actually asked him about this point, about priority or so on, was when he'd been at an athletics meeting in Boxing Day 1946. He was asked by a sports reporter whether it was true that he should be credited with the original idea for the electronic brain. And so the report is that he was diffident about this, but gave credit for the donkey work to the Americans. So that's the nearest I know for his somewhat cheeky comments on the priority question and the relationship between the British and the American efforts in that point. A rather typical one, not, however, I'd say the one calculated to get ahead in either self-promotion or indeed perhaps, anyway, it's not, that was what he was like. And but as it happened, that very evening he was off on the Queen Elizabeth liner to the United States, and indeed did meet von Neumann and the other people working on the American developments, but he himself stuck pretty well to the British ones. The Brits were well ahead at this point. I mean, they had an awful lot going for them, and simply they were building on the tremendous things that had been done in the code-breaking work during the war. But that wasn't really followed up. I mean, no one really knew how to harness that and turn that into a major peacetime industry. This is Alan Turing at the right here of, that's him on the right, at the console of the machine built at Manchester in 1950. And again, you see he's slightly been made somewhat the outsider. Here are the engineers. They're actually built the thing, and he's become more of an onlooker. He wasn't able to remain that central figure connecting both idea and implementation in the way that he would have liked. What he did do, and did remain at the center of, was the idea of artificial intelligence, building on the idea of a brain, and that's when he produced the most famous paper, I think, that he wrote, which is the one published in 1950 in a philosophical journal with the title of Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And this is the one which contains the concept of the Turing test, which the whole point of which it is human. It was witty. Some people might say it's a bit silly in places. It has jokes. It is about whether a computer could understand a joke. It has a subtext which says, we're talking about machines, but I'm also telling you I'm human, because it has a lot about himself. It is about what it's like to be human and what you're comparing a computer with. And of course, it has remained, for all of these reasons and for many more. I mean, it actually has a very rigorous description of what you mean by what a computer is about, the whole theory of computability, the concept of the universal machine, the new paradigm of digital computation, the new paradigm of what it means to be determined within a digital structure. All of these things are in this paper, as well as practical suggestions for how artificial intelligence might be developed, which are now might call either top-down or bottom-up ideas. They're all in there. Turing also in this period gave a very remarkable picture of scientific development. I think this is the one where he does actually give a picture of science and civilization. This is probably just the one. And it's it's something that's very down to earth about his own life. And it's a statement about the role of the individual, the isolated man. Of course, the language is all terribly, I mean, as everyone was in those days, is terribly sexist, but we have to allow for that. Does not develop any power. It's necessary to be immersed in an environment. And there's a very self-deprecating view here, that you absorb something within the first 20 years of life. That's in itself an interesting expression. And I think that reflects something that he must have thought really happened when he was 20 and took off. That's an autobiographical element there, I think. And then he describes his work as a little research of his own, and very few discoveries which are passed on. Again, it's the being absorbed into the stream of science that really is important, rather than the individual contribution, which fades, and it is not so important in science in the long run. It's the absorption. And there's a picture of the search for new techniques must be regarded as carried out by the human community rather than by individuals. That's a very striking statement, all the more so as he of all people was actually one that, was the most individual in his approach, and came up with ideas which are absolutely out of the box and not at all what other people were up to. It's worth thinking also that about this whole process, that no one reading that, there are a lot of people thinking about planning of science and the whole place of science in the modern and civilized, hopefully more socialist, democratic world and so forth. A lot of talk about that in the 1930s. No one looking at that paper in 1936 would really have guessed that that was the pivot point, that was the new focus, that was going to be a dominant technology of the late 20th century and into the 21st. Is not a thing that one would... I can feel him resisting a talk about planning science and seeing how it's going to be applied to society, because I think he would have known that it's extremely difficult to do that. It's extremely difficult to know where ideas are going to lead. Again, looking at the photograph in 1939, that young man there was going to be this pivot of the intellectual effort, which was central to the outcome of the Second World War. It's an amazing thing. Well, he didn't rest there. In 1950, he started a completely new focus on biological growth, a mathematical theory of biological growth, which also had the effect of being the first large-scale pure research project pursued on an electronic computer. There were only a handful of electronic computers at that stage. Manchester had one of them, and he had it as a personal computer, really, to use. His ideas were essentially parallel to the elucidation of DNA, which happened in just the same period, but it didn't have the same impact, and it was at least 20 years before those theories really were taken up by other people. And indeed, the experimental verification of those ideas is something which is only really now beginning to be taken seriously, and is now a hot area in biology. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1951, but it wasn't for this. They couldn't know how important that was going to be. It was for the work he'd done in 1936. So you can't say he was unknown or not noticed. He was a noted figure of the time, and was going somewhere. But unfortunately, this is where life bit back at him. His individual life as a gay man, I've said very little about, but he's certainly become more confident in his relationships after the war, and enjoyed the more exploratory aspects of gay life in the late 1940s. But this came to a very sticky conclusion when a young man he'd met in Manchester, his associates found out about it, and there was a burglary of his house that got to the police. The police realized immediately what was going on and arrested him. Alan Turing was he was very truthful about what had happened. He tried at first to make up a cover story, but it was hopeless, and he just gave a very clear account of the affair. And it was a very serious matter. It was taken extremely seriously. This was against the law, as it was in England, and indeed as it was in most countries at that time. You probably wouldn't have guessed that it would be taken so seriously that he was threatened with prison, and that to escape prison, he had to undertake these injections of estrogen, which was then headlined in the local newspaper in this way. There can't be many headlines in which the words "put on probation" are combined with the most profound and original mathematical mind of his generation, but that one is it. Turing's way of talking about it was to deal with it as much as possible by dark humor and irony, And this is some words that he wrote referring both to his artificial intelligence ideas, but also, Turing believes machines think, Turing lies with men, therefore machines do not think. It's so many layers in that. It's the layer of it's the pattern of a syllogism, which is the beginning of mathematical logic. It's a biblical allusion, lying with men. It's old-fashioned words and the pun on lying. And that was what he was like. His conversation was of that nature. It was playful. And this is a way also, in writing to a gay friend of his about what had happened, of trying to make light of it and making it easier for other people to feel that he was coping with the whole thing. His whole attitude actually was that of resistance to what had happened, and his immediate reaction in summer of 1952 was that if he couldn't behave as he wanted in England because of the law, he could go abroad. In fact, that wasn't the first time. He loved going to France, where the law was different. And in this period, 1952, he somehow got wind of the fact that a gay rights movement had got started in Scandinavia at that very early date. And he headed for Norway. I think it was a bit disappointing what he found, but that was the point. However, there was another whole element to this which his friends did not know about, but must have been extremely important. This was also the same period when the concept of gay men as a security risk was developed. It was after 1948. That had not been such an explicit policy during the Second World War, and indeed he'd been comparatively open about his sexuality during the Second World War. But in 1952, essentially because of and propelled by American security concerns, this was a major issue. And indeed, gay men were excluded from secret work of the nature he'd been doing until the late 90s. That was the situation, and he was that was policy. And he had been doing further work for GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of the NSA and the continuation of the wartime code-breaking work. We don't know what it was because all this material is still completely secret. But he had been doing it, and it was stopped, of course, in 1952. And there must, of course, have been questions about what he was doing, what he knew, how he was behaving, what he could be expected to do in the future, and so forth. There must have been very difficult and upsetting discussions of that nature. Turing himself was not very keen on contemporary new language about security. I'm sorry, I don't know how this has happened, but so many of my quotations seem to have a flavor of old-fashioned prejudice against the American usages. I can't think how that could possibly have happened. But I think you have to. But the word classified he thought was ridiculous because it doesn't mean what it says and so forth. So that's that conveys what would have been his view of anything to do with the whole security industry as it began at that period. And indeed, there was also a crisis of which he made very light and talks in very ironic terms about what he called the poor sweeties of the British police hunting him in 1953 when the young man from Norway came to visit him and was intercepted and turned back. Now, again, a somewhat mysterious episode, but simply must have reflected the fact that as someone holding the most secret work of the Second World War and American secrets as well and post-war information, he was not really free to conduct a kind of personal life which belonged to decades which were not his. Belonged to a world which did not then exist. He had just a picture of personal freedom which could not be implemented at that time. And this is a fascinating period. He died in 1954, so I should point out and make clear that was 2 years after the crisis of the arrest. He did a lot of work in that period, and did a great deal did not fade away, he did not collapse, he continued active work in mathematical biology. He recruited what would have been the beginning of a modern research group with graduate students who could have been built up into a whole new area of collaborative work. He took on new interests, new intellectual and scientific interests, and this full of different, various things that happened. I think my feeling about this period is it's something that relates to that 1938 decision. He had made a decision for himself to get involved in highly worldly affairs. And that wasn't really his thing. His thing really was the world of pure science. He had lent himself to the terrible emergency which was caused by the outbreak of Nazi Germany and its threat to the whole world. But he'd done that, but that wasn't really his thing, doing that. His thing was being as a simple scientist, seeking for truth and all that, and this beautiful mathematics. And that was his thing. He longed to get back to that. And indeed, in 1954, he took on new interests in quantum mechanics, relativity, and pure mathematics. So very various things. By no means a simple picture. Not a simple picture of depression, but a picture of resistance to everything that had happened, and a picture of wanting to see more and more advance. And yet, at the same time, he was certainly, from spring of 1953 onwards, he was thinking about his will and clearly thinking about his imminent death. And in February 1954, he wrote his will, which is a very distinctive one, involving partitioning his estate between 5 people, all of them distinguished by being supportive to him as a gay man. One of them was his mother, and one of them was his boyfriend, Neville Johnson, and who the relationship which had broken down in 1952 with the events of the arrest. One was Robin Gandy, who became his main follower, and one was Nick Furbank, who was well known as the biographer of E.M. Forster and perhaps his closest friend at this point. That was almost a shocking will at that point, but one that was extremely deliberate, and one that was really thought out and very, very unusual in its form. And that was this very, very mixed picture was the background in which he died on 7th of June 1954, and it was indeed, cyanide poisoning. There's no question of that at all. He had ingested a substantial amount of potassium cyanide. There was indeed an apple at the scene, and there was indeed electrical wiring, because it was dressed up as an experiment with doing gold plating, for which you use potassium cyanide as an electrolytic solution. And these are elements from the coroner's report. They were mentioning the famous apple. It was indeed there. There were indeed bites taken out of it. And this, of course, has inspired many people to make a connection with a well-known computer company. But he could not have known that. But there isn't. There's an element in here which is tragic and so on, but also has its extraordinary resonance of something beyond normal life. And an aspect of that is the following, that in 1951, he had a running partner who was an 18-year-old school student, Alan Garner. Alan Garner is now famous because he's the author of one of the most famous children's books or young person's books called The Owl Service, published in the 1960s. And he is a great writer of modern iconography. It so happened that by chance they started running together around in the countryside around Alan Turing's house in 1951. And Garner recalls very vividly that there was a point where they both discussed this image of the apple in Walt Disney's Snow White. And Turing saw it as an iconic, as a symbol of life and death, which is quite an extraordinary thing that he conveyed this to someone who in turn became a a writer of modern icons, and is famous for that. As I have no doubt at all that he had conceived of this manner of death as one which did indeed fool his mother, or at least he liked to believe that it was an accident in the course of a chemical experiment, and yet left also this surreal image which has haunted the future of a form of a very unusual death. It was, in fact, I'm sure, something that went back to what he'd planned back in 1937 before he saw the famous film. And as an icon, well, it remains with us and is constantly raised in people's description of the life and death, and it, of course, isn't a particularly happy one as an icon for the future of science and civilization. It is an unfortunate fact that the person who was at the center of these great themes of scientific development and the foundation of the modern world, both this great history of the 20th century, the emergence of the digital, the questioning of the basis of mind, and indeed even of the transformation of our biological structure, how it comes about. These things, which already had great effects and may have many greater ones in the future, I'm afraid I have no doubt, was someone also who found his place as an individual quite incompatible with the collective world in which he was placed. But of course, on the other hand, we may say there are very positive things one can say about the development of the world since his time, and certainly since the time that I wrote the book about him. I wouldn't have believed the kind of changes in social consciousness which have made his story one that now speaks with encouragement and sense of brilliance and splendor to young people now, and not just as something which is an embarrassment, but as something which continues to inspire. And one of the most exciting things, I think, is to find that young people certainly find this a wonderful story to know something about. And of course, as Alan Turing himself learned a great deal from those who communicated science to him in his early years, it's always wonderful to think of that being transmitted onto people who can continue that tradition into the future. So that would end my points on a more positive note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? I would like to start by saying that, well, Alan Turing sacrificed himself, as you said, by immersing himself in the worldly world.
Yes, yes.
He sacrificed himself, as did many people in England and many people in the United States, for a very good cause. And he became a victim of the McCarthy era and its tentacles across the ocean, which is sad and unfortunate, but many people whose descendants are in this room owe their existence and survival to people like Alan Turing and Johnny von Neumann and Shannon and many others. So many of us are grateful to Bletchley Park. Do you think that he saw himself as a victim of historical circumstances? Do you think that he would not have committed suicide today?
Well, I think that's what people call an unhistorical question if we try and place him today, isn't it?
But you hinted that he thought about suicide as early as the 30s.
Yes, I think for different reasons. I mean, I think then he was unhappy and just loneliness, and indeed he was in love with one of the other graduate students, Morris Price, who actually followed the other route and went into the atomic bomb project and became a noted physicist. And it was very unfortunate, and I think that could well have been the trigger for that particular feeling. So that was classic problems of a young person who's very isolated and can't express and find any satisfaction. Whereas at the end of his life, I think he had good friends, and he had able to find all sorts of ways of communicating. That wasn't so much the problem at all. I think the thing he could not talk about either was the fact that he was in this absolutely unique position as the person who knew everything about the British communications world, and indeed would have been caught in the American sphere as well.
And was excluded from further work.
Certainly
Like
excluded,
Oppenheimer.
but he couldn't, of course, lose the information that he already had. That was the period when he died. You mentioned Oppenheimer's name, and of course that's an important parallel, because Oppenheimer, again, is a pure scientist who took on a very major organizational responsibility, which was not really his thing. I mean, it wasn't any more, he was more of an organizational person than Turing was, but there was a certain parallel there. And it was the week that Turing died was essentially the same week as the climax of the Oppenheimer hearings. It was the very period when in the world press, the concept of Oppenheimer as the Soviet agent was being put around, not very much hidden as an accusation. It was a period when, for the Western countries, they really didn't know who was reliable and who wasn't. And that was a genuine fact, so they really didn't. And the upper class trust that Turing himself would have believed in and taken for granted very strongly had been completely undermined by the defection of British people of exactly the same background as Turing to the Soviet Union in 1951. Again, they were just the kind of people that would have said, oh, they're our chaps, they're all right. Who knew anything now? In fact, we know that there were other people in the British establishment who were, I mean, who knew? No one, there was no certainty about these things at all. The Second World War was very different. There were indeed, yes.
We have a young lady there waiting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a personal interest in entropy. You said in 2012 a paper was declassified in which we would see a measure that we would call Shannon entropy. Should we be calling it Turing entropy? Do you know to what extent he was aware of Gibbs's entropy?
No, on the last bit, I don't know. He didn't call it entropy, he called it weight of evidence. It's just that it is the same p log p measure. So it arises from his idea of giving a numerical measure based on the logarithm. So it's logarithm of the probabilities. He thought it was logarithm of the odds, actually. So the p log p gives the expected gain in probability from a piece of evidence. It just coincides with a measure of information that you get in Shannon's theory. I think Turing probably was unaware of any predecessor ideas. I suspect he thought that entirely for himself. He would have discussed it with Shannon, though, I think, at their meeting in 1943. Turing himself didn't take this any further, but if you wanted to follow up that question, I think you should probably look at the book written by I.J. Good, who was Turing's statistical assistant in the naval Enigma work, and became a very prominent, notable statistician, mathematical statistician in the post-war era. He wrote a book in 1950 called Probability and the Weighing of Evidence, which is essentially Turing's theory, but of course it's given in a way which doesn't give away why it came about. So that would be a good source for you to look at to see if you can trace the antecedents. And in fact, Good has written quite a number of other historical articles about this area, which I recommend you have a look at.
Thank you very much.
On the left, sir.
Hi. Yeah. So I was wondering what your book has been around for a while, and there has been a lot of information that has been, and I suspect, declassified since the book, and I was wondering if there's any information that gave you new insight into Turing that has been declassified since you wrote the book.
Okay,
and
well,
if you have any intention of maybe writing another book about that information.
Well, as a matter of fact, all right. So yes, there has been a lot of the documents, and so there's much more detail on the Second World War material, which came out essentially in the 90s. I mean, I got the material from a limited amount of disclosures and then personal interviews, and also the accounts of the military historical side to the Bletchley Park work, you see, and then putting those together. And on the whole, the account I gave is okay. But there's much more detail about dates and details of the cipher systems now available. Well, my principle on this is, well, there's a preface to the newer editions of my book which give pointers to the major topics. And then also I have a website which gives links to all more recent disclosures and other sources of information. So probably what I'll develop that into is something of the nature of an e-book, which has an update chapter by chapter with such information. I mean, I think that's an area where digital publishing has a real role, I think, in supplementing something which is a written text. Written text is something that has its value, but of course the way that it can be added to much more flexibly by electronic means is also a marvelous thing, and I'd like to make full use of that. Yeah.
Good evening. The gentleman with whom I came elected me their spokesperson. We have 4 questions.
Oh, right.
Whatever happened to Joan Clark? Whatever happened to John Turing, the brother? And did he have children? That's question 2. Were Alan's...
Can we stay with those for now so he has a chance to answer?
Okay.
All right, Joan Clark, Google. I mean, or go to my website and you'll find the link to the... She died in 1998. She continued to work for GCHQ after the war, and she retired in about 1990 and died in 1998 in Oxford. And so that's what she did. And she married after the war. She became Joan Murray.
Okay.
But you can read about her if you follow my links or whatever. So that's not a mystery anyway. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And his brother, his elder brother, John Turing, he died in 1984, I think. And he has a son who is now the prominent figure who's a trustee of the Bletchley Park Trust and taken very active interest in the history of Bletchley Park. He's Sir John Dermot Turing. And so you find him again if you Google. And he's written a book on the Enigma, in fact. He has written a book called, what's it called? Demystifying the Enigma or something like that, I think. So he's very active. Just recently, actually, he's become a much more active figure in this. But Dermot Turing never actually, he was only born in 1960, I think, so he didn't overlap with Alan Turing himself.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure how. Yeah.
On the left? He was first. So. Okay. We'll take just 2 more questions.
Yeah, given that we're looking at this from a historic perspective, and Turing is, sort of best known for breaking the Enigma code, what was his intellectual respect or interpretation of the people who created it in the beginning?
I don't know. They weren't. Well, I don't think they would have been very high. I don't think. The Enigma wasn't a very. It was a pretty mediocre modification of the original. You should understand that the Enigma was a well-known commercial device that had been produced in the early 1920s and was available to banks and anyone who wanted it. But then the military form of it was what mattered. That was much more complicated. I haven't shown any pictures of it here, but it had an extra super enciphering plug board on it, which that really was the core of its difficulty. Now, that's essentially what Turing's brilliant logic overcame. And if it had been a bit more difficult, it would have been impossible for the Poles to have made their inroads into it in the late 1930s. I don't think they'd ever have got started. The British modification of the Enigma was much more successful. It had 5 or 6 rotors and a different logical complexity inside. And it just didn't have the weakness of the German Enigma, and it wasn't broken, and it would have been far more difficult. It's just another order of complexity. Basically, I don't think you'd have had it wasn't so much the Enigma, but it was the modification made of it to it in 1931, which by the Wehrmacht, which was just a big mistake. I mean, so I don't think you'd have had a particular high respect for it. An interesting thing, though, is that what he wouldn't have known was that German logicians were working against him on the German side. And in particular, he'd corresponded with Heinrich Schultz, who was one of the few logicians left in Nazi Germany. And he wouldn't have known, I think, that Schultz was actually working in the department responsible for the Enigma. Indeed, they had brief contact after the war as well. I don't think they would have known that. I mean, that's a fascinating question. And there's another fascinating question as to what extent the German cryptographers suspected that it wasn't all that as good as it should be. But,
so we'll take one more question on the left, and then Dr. Hodges will sign some books, and we'll have some more books for sale on the stage. Please, sir.
Well, this is Los Angeles, so I understand the movie had took quite a few liberties. Did you have any chance to talk some sense into the screenwriters?
Oh, that's...
It seems like such a story. Why do you need to invent things?
Yeah, well, I think I better pass on that one, because I don't want my... well, the difficulty here is that any remark one makes can be instantly translated into Twitter feed and so forth. So I think I better leave that alone, that particular question.
You can come and take off the microphone and discuss it in private. Thank you very much.